So now let's take a look at the next type of COVID-19 vaccine, the protein subunit vaccine. Well, in order to understand this vaccine, we first need to take a look at SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes the disease COVID-19. So as shown in this figure, I'm sure you can see that SARS-CoV-2 has certain spike proteins protruding out of its surface. These spike proteins are unique to SARS-CoV-2. So how does this relate to protein subunit vaccines? Well, as you can see right here, protein subunit vaccines actually inject these spike proteins into our body. This is different from mRNA vaccines, which were discussed in the last video, as mRNA vaccines inject mRNA into our body, which directs ribosomes to create spike proteins. However, in protein subunit vaccines, spike proteins are directly injected into our body. There's no mRNA or ribosomes involved. But don't worry, these spike proteins are completely harmless individually. They cannot cause COVID-19. So why would we want a piece of SARS-CoV-2 to be in our body? Isn't that counterintuitive? Well, think about it this way. Spike proteins are foreign to our body. They're not native in our body. They're not supposed to be found in our body. Therefore, they're considered an antigen. And antigens create an immune response in our body. So that's what the spike protein will also do. So the spike protein will lead to the humoral immune response occurring in our body. If you want more information on the humoral immune response, you should check out my previous video on the adaptive immune system, where I explain the humoral immune response in depth. So this antigen and the humoral immune response will lead to the cloning of a bunch of B plasma cells and B memory cells. B plasma cells release antibodies that can bind to these spike proteins and neutralize them. Meanwhile, B memory cells store B cell receptors and antibodies for later. So why is this important? Why do we want this to happen? Well, essentially because spike proteins are on the SARS-CoV-2 normally, if we were to ever get infected by SARS-CoV-2, our body would already have the antibodies and resources necessary to fight off SARS-CoV-2, since our B memory cells would store the antibodies required to bind to the spike proteins on SARS-CoV-2 and neutralize it, which would prevent SARS-CoV-2 from infecting our cells. So that's how the protein subunit vaccine works. So what are some examples of protein subunit vaccines? Well, there's only one approved protein subunit vaccine thus far, and that is Epivac Corona, which is made by the Vector State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology in Russia. It has only been approved in Russia, Belarus, and Turkmenistan thus far. You may be surprised that there's only one protein subunit vaccine that has currently been approved to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Although protein subunit vaccines seem like a really simple and safe method, they have a few disadvantages that have prevented them from becoming a widespread mechanism to fighting off the COVID-19 pandemic. The first of these disadvantages is that protein subunit vaccines only initiate antibody-mediated immune responses. What does that mean? Well, the immune system is a very, very large and complex thing, and I only explained to you one part of the immune system, the humoral immune response, which is the part that actually includes antibodies. Well, antibodies are not the only defense mechanism of our bodies against pathogens. We have a lot of defense mechanisms right in here. But because protein subunit vaccines don't actually inject a virus inside of us, they only inject an antigen inside of us, the protein subunit vaccine only activates the antibody-mediated response and not the rest of our immune system. Therefore, protein subunit vaccines actually lead to a weaker immune response than other types of vaccines. So a lot of times protein subunit vaccines require booster shots or adjuvants, which are things that help generate an immune response to be administered along with the protein subunit vaccine. Second, protein subunit vaccines are made using living organisms like yeast and bacteria, which require a food source to grow on and a lot of hygiene measures because you want to avoid contamination with other organisms. Therefore, protein subunit vaccines are more expensive to produce than chemically synthesized vaccines like mRNA vaccines. Third, the manufacturing method for protein subunit vaccines is very precise, so it takes a long time to make. So who knows, maybe we'll see more protein subunit vaccines be approved in the future. Well, that's the entirety of protein subunit vaccines. Hopefully you learned a lot, and make sure to check out the next video where I'm going to talk about inactivated vaccines.